What if I told you that a single whispered conversation at Clarence's house could bring an entire monarchy to its knees? Imagine it, a father and son behind closed doors, shadows cast long in a gilded room that has witnessed more secrets than any courtroom in history. But this time, it wasn't just about grievances, apologies, or regrets. It was about survival. And standing just beyond that threshold, watching from the periphery like a hawk, was Princess Anne. The woman known for her steel, for her sharp tongue, and for her unshakable loyalty to the firm. She would be the one to uncover a truth so devastating that it would shatter what little remained of Prince Harry's bond with the royal family. But before we dive into the shocking exposure, let me ask you, what would drive a prince, a man born into centuries of privilege, to allegedly trade the deepest secrets of his family for money and fame? Desperation? Greed? Or revenge? That's the question that frames this story. And that's why what unfolded inside Clarence's house just a few weeks ago matters not only for the royals, but for anyone who has ever wondered how far someone might go to rewrite their place in history. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's rewind for a moment. Harry's visits to the UK these days are rare, calculated, and always under the microscope. No longer the adored spare, no longer shielded by palace walls. Every step he takes in London feels like a statement. Some claim he still seeks reconciliation. Others insist every trip is a strategic move, an attempt to carve out leverage against the very institution that made him. But this last visit was different. Quiet, cloaked. The kind of visit that whispers through corridors rather than shouts across headlines. The kind of visit that feels more dangerous because it wasn't meant to be known. And then comes Clarence's house. A place dripping with history, where King Charles entertains guests of state and holds private audiences. But it was here that father and son sat across from one another, the weight of years of betrayal, interviews, and revelations pressing between them. What was said in that room? We'll get to that. But more importantly, who knew about it? That's where Princess Anne enters. Now ask yourself, why Anne? Why is it always the so-called quiet royal, the one who avoids drama and headlines, who becomes the guardian of the monarchy's hardest truths? She isn't flashy. She isn't indulgent. She doesn't tolerate nonsense. And perhaps that's why she noticed something no one else dared to. While others still tried to balance affection with forgiveness and had no illusions. To her, Harry wasn't just a wayward nephew. He was a liability. Picture it, and learning of the meeting. Her instincts telling her something was wrong. She'd seen enough scandals to recognize when smoke meant fire. But this wasn't just family drama. This was potentially explosive. What if Harry had gone to Clarence's house not to reconcile, but to negotiate? Not to heal, but to threaten? That possibility, once whispered into Anne's ear, could not be ignored. And here's where the story sharpens. Because this wasn't just about loyalty. This was about survival. The monarchy has withstood wars, abdications, divorces, and tragedies, but never has it faced a prince who chose to weaponize its most private matters in exchange for money and public sympathy. And yet, what if that's exactly what Anne uncovered? Let's not forget Harry's track record. Spare. The Oprah interview. The Netflix series. Every step has been laced with revelation, each time packaged as honesty, but also conveniently monetized. The pattern was there. So when Anne pieced together whispers about Harry's Clarence's house meeting, the stakes became terrifyingly clear. I want you to imagine sitting in her shoes. You've given your life to duty. You've sacrificed privacy, ambition, and freedom for one singular cause, the crown. And now, your nephew, a man who once swore loyalty to queen and country, sits in your brother's study, perhaps plotting how to dismantle it all from the outside. Would you stay silent? Or would you expose him? Here's the contradiction that makes this moment so riveting. On one hand, Harry still presents himself as a man searching for peace, healing from the wounds of a mother lost too soon, a soldier scarred by war, a husband and father determined to protect his family. On the other, his actions tell another story, of contracts signed, deals inked, and the royal brand being rebranded for personal gain. Which Harry was at Clarence's house that day? The grieving son? Or the opportunist? And what about Charles? The man has waited decades for the throne. He knows better than anyone the fragility of the crown. Did he see his son's visit as an olive branch? Or did he, too, suspect that Harry's words came with hidden terms? Insiders whisper that Charles's face darkened during that meeting, that the warmth he longed to show was replaced by a chill he couldn't hide. Could it be that Charles realized, in that very moment, that his son was no longer a part of the solution, but the problem itself? But the most haunting detail isn't Charles's reaction. It's Anne's. Sources suggest she intercepted word of what was said, whether through staff, trusted aides, or perhaps directly from Charles himself. However she got it, the result was the same, and believed Harry had crossed a line, that he wasn't just airing grievances anymore. He was considering selling secrets. And that, for Anne, was unforgivable. Think about it. This isn't just sibling rivalry. This isn't just family squabbling. This is Anne, the only daughter of the late Queen, effectively accusing her nephew of treason against the very institution that gave him his title, his platform, his identity. How damning must the evidence have been for her, and to move against her own flesh and blood? And here's where the stakes skyrocket. Because once Anne exposed Harry's alleged intentions, the firm had no choice. Silence would mean weakness. Action would mean severing the last fragile threads that tied Harry to the family. So which would they choose? We'll get to that. But first, remember this. Every great downfall begins not with a roar, but with a whisper. And that whisper, caught in the corridors of Clarence House, may have been the sound of Harry's royal life unraveling forever. Because as Anne prepared to act, she wasn't just exposing a nephew. She was protecting a monarchy. But what exactly did she uncover? And how would it set into motion the most dramatic royal showdown of this generation? That's where our story truly begins. What happens when a meeting meant to mend fences becomes the spark that burns bridges instead? That is exactly the shadow hanging over Clarence House during Harry's recent visit. This wasn't just a casual father and son chat. It wasn't a simple tea, a handshake, or a quick exchange of pleasantries. No, this was orchestrated, planned, weighted with intention. The moment Harry's car pulled up outside Clarence House, eyes followed. The London air was heavy with speculation. Was this the long-awaited moment of reconciliation between Charles and his youngest son? Or was it something more dangerous? Something calculated? Remember, Harry doesn't come to London without a purpose anymore. Every trip is like a chess move, and this one was no different. Inside Clarence House, the atmosphere was tense. Thick curtains drawn, guards posted discreetly. The same walls that once witnessed laughter, family dinners, and planning for state affairs were about to absorb something entirely different. Charles sat in his study, surrounded by centuries of tradition, books, portraits, symbols of duty. And into this sanctum walked Harry, the son who had traded royal life for Californian sunshine, who had branded himself as both victim and rebel, who had already monetized his family's pain through interviews, memoirs, and streaming deals. But why now? Why did Harry request this meeting at all? That's the first question we must answer. To some, it was about nostalgia, a son craving his father's approval again. To others, it was leverage, Harry arriving with unspoken demands. Was he there to reconcile? Or to negotiate? Now, imagine this scene. Charles rises to greet him. Their handshake is firm, but not warm. The silence between them stretches just a little too long. Harry clears his throat, as if rehearsing words he knows will sting. Charles leans back, measured, guarded, every instinct screaming that this conversation will not be easy. And what about the content of that talk? We may never know every word, but whispers have begun to leak. Words about deals, opportunities. The line between private family matters and public consumption blurred once again. Could it be that Harry hinted at information he held? Information that could devastate the monarchy if shared outside those walls? Was it a veiled threat? Or a desperate plea for acknowledgement and financial backing? Here's where the story sharpens into suspicion. Because Clarence House isn't a place where one arrives unobserved. Staff notice. Schedules are logged. And this is where Princess Anne comes into the frame. Did she hear whispers before the meeting even began? Did someone loyal tip her off, knowing her role as the family's quiet sentinel? And has always been the firm's unsung protector. She doesn't chase headlines. She doesn't indulge in theatrics. But she sees everything. And when she learned of this secret father-son meeting, alarms went off. To Anne, there is no such thing as coincidence where Harry is concerned. His track record of revealing intimate family matters for public consumption has already proven too costly. So why? She must have asked herself. would this meeting be any different? Let me turn the question back to you. If you knew someone in your family had a history of exposing private affairs for their own benefit, would you trust them behind closed doors with your most vulnerable relative? Or would you suspect ulterior motives every single time? And so the scene grows darker. The conversation between Charles and Harry, though hidden from the world, becomes a point of fear inside the palace walls. Some say Charles tried to be patient, to offer a father's ear. Others suggest he grew visibly cold as Harry spoke, realizing the gravity of what was unfolding. Could it be that Charles, in that very moment, understood that his son was no longer just estranged, but potentially dangerous to the crown itself? This is where history collides with present. Remember the abdication crisis of 1936? When Edward VIII sacrificed the throne for Wallis Simpson, the monarchy nearly collapsed. Back then, it was about love versus duty. But now, in Harry's case, it could be about profit versus loyalty. And history has taught the royals one chilling lesson. Once trust is broken, the monarchy must act swiftly or risk losing everything. As the meeting stretched on, Clarence House seemed to absorb the tension. Staff shifted nervously. Rumors swirled in hushed tones. And somewhere, beyond the closed door, and suspicions sharpened into resolve. For her, it wasn't just about family anymore. It was about the institution. If Harry was truly there to push his father into a corner and would not let it go unchecked. But here's the cruel irony. Perhaps Harry believed he was speaking in confidence. Perhaps he thought Charles, bound by paternal love, would keep his words locked away. But in the palace, nothing stays hidden for long. Not when duty outweighs blood. Not when, and is listening. And so we end this chapter on a knife's edge. A private conversation, a watchful sister, and the sense that what Harry thought was a negotiation could soon be turned into an accusation. Because the truth is this. The meeting that should never have happened might become the very reason Harry is cut off from the family forever. But what did Princess Anne actually discover about that meeting? And how did she turn suspicion into undeniable proof? That's where the story takes its next shocking twist. What happens when the one royal you least expect to meddle suddenly becomes the one person holding the keys to the entire family's survival? That's the role Princess Anne found herself in. The workhorse royal. The no-nonsense princess. The woman who famously once told paparazzi to naff off. And is the last person anyone associates with drama. And yet, in this moment, she became the very heart of it. Because let's face it, if there's one member of the royal family who has always put duty above self, it's Anne. She doesn't crave the spotlight. She doesn't scheme for influence. And she certainly doesn't waste time entertaining nonsense. But that is precisely why she is so dangerous to anyone who threatens the monarchy. She isn't distracted by emotion. She isn't blinded by sentimentality. She sees things exactly as they are. And when it came to Harry, she saw through everything. Think about it. This is a woman who has lived through more scandals than most of us could imagine. The divorces of her siblings, the explosive fallout of Diana, the messy realities of Andrew. She has watched the monarchy bend but not break under public pressure, always learning, always adapting. If anyone knows what it takes to protect the crown from internal sabotage, it's Anne. So when she caught wind of Harry's private meeting at Clarence House, her instincts kicked in immediately. Why would Harry request a secret audience with Charles? Why would it be handled so quietly, so discreetly, away from William, away from other senior royals? To Anne, the answer was obvious, because Harry didn't want anyone else to hear what he had to say. And if secrecy was required, that meant danger. Now, let me ask you, if you had a nephew with a track record of exposing family secrets for books, interviews, and documentaries, would you believe for 1 second that a secret meeting was innocent? Or would you, like Anne, assume the worst? And began piecing things together the way only she could, quietly, methodically, without drawing attention. Whispers from staff, notes and diaries, aides who caught fragments of conversation. She wasn't prying. She was protecting. And as the puzzle formed in front of her, one picture became clear. Harry wasn't there to heal wounds. He was there to probe for information. To understand why Anne reacted so fiercely, you need to know how she views the monarchy. Unlike Charles, who is often accused of being too soft, or William, who is still balancing duty with emotion and has no illusions. To her, the monarchy is not a family, it's an institution, a fortress. and any weakness, any crack in its walls, must be sealed immediately, even if that crack comes in the form of her own nephew. Let's pause here and consider the irony. Harry once adored Anne. As a boy, he saw her as the tough aunt, the one who always kept things simple. But now, as a man, he found himself on the receiving end of her suspicion. And Anne doesn't suspect lightly. She started digging deeper. Reports suggest she had access to conversations between Charles and his closest advisors following the Clarence House meeting. Something Charles said must have alarmed her. Perhaps it was the tone, perhaps it was a slip of detail, but Anne's mind immediately went to one conclusion. Harry was playing a dangerous game. But here's the contradiction that makes this moment so fascinating. Harry likely believed he was appealing to his father's compassion. He probably thought Charles would be too torn by paternal love to say anything to anyone. But Anne understood something Harry had overlooked. Charles may be a father, but he is also the king. And Anne was determined to remind him of that fact. This is where Anne's reputation as the enforcer truly comes to life. Because while William fumes and Charles hesitates and acts, she isn't swayed by tears or guilt trips. She doesn't waver in the face of family tension. If she believes Harry posed a threat to the monarchy, then she would stop him at any cost. And so she began to gather her evidence. Piece by piece, she looked at Harry's recent history, the Oprah interview, Spare, the Netflix documentary. She connected the dots. Every time Harry had spoken to the family in confidence, it later emerged as public material, rebranded and monetized. Why would this time be any different? Now let me ask you, the audience. If someone has shown you a pattern of betrayal over and over, how many chances do they get before you cut them off completely? And decided Harry had already had enough chances. Imagine the scene. And, sitting alone in her private study at Gatcombe Park, the weight of duty pressing down on her. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't allow this meeting to pass without intervention. And so she prepared herself, not for a confrontation with Harry just yet, but for a confrontation with her brother, the king. But let's not forget, Anne is a strategist. She wouldn't rush in recklessly. She would plan. She would time her move carefully, ensuring she had enough leverage to make Charles listen. And when Anne makes up her mind, there's no undoing it. Yet here's where the suspense deepens. Anne wasn't just dealing with suspicions. She was sitting on something more concrete. A detail, a fragment, a piece of the conversation that, if true, proved Harry was not there for reconciliation, but for negotiation. For leverage. For money. What exactly did Anne discover? Was it a phrase Harry used? A hint that he had contacts in Hollywood ready to pay for more insider stories? A veiled threat that unless his demands were met, secrets would spill? Whatever it was enough to convince Anne that Harry's intentions were toxic. And that realization led her to the next chilling decision. She would not stay silent. She would not let Charles be manipulated. She would not let Harry dangle royal secrets like carrots for the highest bidder. Because to Anne, this wasn't just betrayal, it was treason. And with that realization, the dominoes began to fall. But here's the cliffhanger. How did Anne take her suspicions, her evidence, and her reputation, and turn them into a weapon strong enough to shake the monarchy into action? The answer lies in the next chapter, where Anne doesn't just suspect, she exposes. What if I told you that the royal family's gravest fears weren't born in tabloids or gossip columns, but in quiet whispers behind palace walls? Because that's exactly where this story now turns. Princess Anne, armed with her instincts and fragments of information, began to uncover the most alarming possibility yet, that Harry was positioning himself to sell out royal secrets for cash and relevance. Let's rewind for a moment. Every monarchy in history has faced betrayal. From Roman emperors poisoned by family members to medieval kings usurped by their brothers, betrayal often comes not from the outside, but from within. And the British monarchy, with all its pomp and centuries-old traditions, has been no exception. Think of Edward VIII, whose abdication for Wallis Simpson nearly tore the institution apart, or the leaks and scandals that plagued Diana's marriage to Charles. But Harry's situation feels different. This wasn't about love or tragedy, it was about profit. And that, to Anne, was unforgivable. She began following the money trail. The memoir Spare had sold millions, generating both revenue and controversy. The Netflix deal with Meghan had brought in staggering sums. Every time Harry spoke, every revelation, Every tear-filled anecdote seemed carefully packaged into a product, a brand. And what was that brand built on? Royal secrets, family pain. The mystique of the monarchy transformed into a commodity. So when Harry sought out Charles and Clarence House and couldn't shake the question, what was the next chapter of this royal product? Was Harry testing the waters for more stories? Fishing for inside details he could later spin into a lucrative deal? Or worse, was he hinting at an outright exchange, access, or financial support in return for silence? Let me ask you, the audience, if you were in Anne's position, would you interpret Harry's actions as desperation for reconciliation, or as cold, calculated strategy to milk the monarchy for all it was worth? Anne's suspicions were soon strengthened by whispers from aides who overheard parts of the Clarence House conversation. They couldn't provide the full transcript, but the fragments were enough. Phrases about opportunities, mentions of the right people willing to listen, words that, to Charles, may have sounded vague, but to Anne screamed of negotiation. Now imagine Anne sitting down with this information. She knows Harry's history. She knows his pattern. And now she sees him possibly dangling secrets like currency. To her, this isn't just a family matter. This is a national security risk for the monarchy. Because let's be clear, royal secrets aren't just gossip. They can influence politics. They can sway public perception. They can destabilize the crown's very foundation. But here's the cruel irony. Harry, in his mind, may have believed he was simply pressing his father for acknowledgement or financial support. He may not have realized how sinister his words sounded to ears already primed with suspicion, and, hardened by decades of palace survival, didn't interpret his words as innocent. She interpreted them as dangerous. And so the thought crystallized. Harry wasn't just lost. He was plotting. And what was his plan? To cash in on the monarchy's deepest wounds, turning private matters into public profit. This revelation shook Anne. She'd seen royals embarrassed before. She'd seen scandals erupt, but never had she faced the idea of a direct blood relative monetizing secrets with such precision. This was no accidental leak. This was strategy. Now, here's a twist that makes the story even more chilling. Rumors began circulating that Harry had already floated exclusive insights to certain media and Hollywood insiders. Nothing confirmed, of course, but Anne knew where there was smoke, there was fire. Was Harry positioning himself for another explosive deal? Another series? Another book? One that could go even deeper. Into state matters, into Charles's private dealings, into the crown's hidden vulnerabilities? Let me challenge you with this. What price would you put on a monarchy's secrets? Millions? Tens of millions? To networks and producers hungry for content, to publishers desperate for sales, the value of Harry's inside knowledge could be astronomical. And that's exactly what Anne feared. Harry knew it, too. But Anne wasn't just suspicious, she was furious. Because to her, this wasn't only betrayal. It was exploitation. Exploitation of the Queen's legacy. Exploitation of Charles's vulnerability. Exploitation of the family that had given Harry everything. And for what? For a fleeting grasp at relevance in America? For a bank balance fattened at the cost of royal dignity? Picture Anne confronting Charles with this. Her words sharp, deliberate. He's not here for reconciliation. He's here to use you. Don't you see? He wants to turn your words into currency. Charles, weary and torn, perhaps tried to defend his son, but Anne would not bend. She had seen too much, and to her, the pattern was undeniable. And so, the weight of history bore down, and now faced a choice. Remain silent and hope Harry's intentions fizzled, or expose him and risk tearing the family apart forever. For Anne, there was no real choice at all. The monarchy had to be protected. The firm had to act. And here's the cliffhanger you've been waiting for. What Anne uncovered didn't just remain whispers in private. It became the spark for a royal intervention, a chain of events that would lead to Harry's effective banishment from the very family he once called home. But how did Anne transform her suspicions into a weapon that forced the monarchy's hand? And what role did Charles himself play in this brewing storm? That's where the next chapter takes us. Inside Clarence House itself, to the tense showdown between father and son, where words became weapons and loyalties were tested like never before. What happens when a father sits across from his son and realizes, perhaps for the first time, that blood isn't thicker than duty? That's the haunting weight that filled Clarence House during that private meeting. This wasn't just Charles and Harry catching up after months apart. No, this was a collision. A collision of love, resentment, fear, and, most dangerously, secrets. The setting itself mattered. Charles's study at Clarence House is a place steeped in history. Dark wood paneling, heavy drapes muting the noise of London beyond. Portraits of monarchs and ancestors staring down as if judging every word. For Charles, it's his sanctuary. For Harry, it must have felt like stepping back into a world that he had so publicly rejected. And yet, there he was, sitting once again across from the man he still called Pa. At first, perhaps, the tone was civil, polite, a cautious dance between estranged family members. Harry speaking of his children, Archie and Lilibet, maybe trying to soften his father with talk of grandchildren Charles barely sees. Charles nodding, listening, but inwardly aching at the distance that fame and scandal had carved between them. But slowly, as the conversation unfolded, something darker seeped in. Harry shifted from small talk to grievances. Old wounds reopened, complaints of being sidelined, of being overshadowed by William, of feeling unsupported when Meghan entered the fold. Charles had heard it all before, but hearing it again, in that private space, was like reliving the nightmare of the Oprah interview all over again. And then came the part that made the king's blood run cold. Harry began to speak of opportunities. Not directly, not bluntly, but with enough suggestion that the message landed. Opportunities to tell more of his truth. Opportunities that others were eager to hear. Opportunities that could be lucrative if framed correctly. Charles sat stiff in his chair, realizing what was being said without it ever being fully spoken. Harry was hinting at more revelations. More secrets. And this time, perhaps, the target wasn't just William, or the courtiers, or the institution, but Charles himself. Let's pause here and ask, what father wouldn't feel a chill hearing his own son imply that their private conversations could one day become public currency? Charles, ever the cautious man, tried to steer the conversation back. He reminded Harry of duty, of legacy, of the burden they all carried. But Harry pressed on. He spoke with the tone of someone who believed he finally had leverage that came not from titles or position, but from knowledge. Knowledge of what had been said and done behind palace walls. The irony is staggering. Harry, once the spare, the boy who was always overlooked, suddenly wielded the most dangerous weapon of all, secrets that could wound the monarchy at its very core. But Charles wasn't just a father in that room. He was the king, and as he listened, the lines between paternal love and royal duty blurred. Was Harry's tone a plea for recognition, or a subtle threat? Was he asking for support, or demanding it in exchange for silence? Sources suggest Charles's demeanor changed during that meeting. At first warm, then cautious, then cold, his eyes narrowing, his replies clipped. A father who had entered the room hoping for reconciliation, now staring at a son he barely recognized. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond those walls, and was piecing this puzzle together. Whether through Charles's later confidences or whispers from trusted aides, she understood what was at stake. To end, there was no ambiguity. Harry wasn't trying to heal, he was negotiating. He was leveraging. And to her, that crossed a line no royal could ever return from. But let's think about Harry for a moment. From his perspective, maybe he truly believed he was justified. He had been hurt. He had been sidelined. He had been painted as the villain. Why shouldn't he use his story, his truth, as a way to reclaim control? Why shouldn't he profit from the very institution that, in his eyes, had profited from him? And that's the tragic contradiction at the heart of this story. A son believing he is righting wrongs. A father believing his son is betraying him. A sister watching from the sidelines, believing the entire crown itself is under threat. By the end of that Clarence House meeting, the distance between father and son had widened, not shrunk. Charles, his patience frayed, reportedly told Harry that reconciliation could not come with conditions. Harry, frustrated, left the room with no resolution. And in that unresolved tension lay the seed of his downfall. Because what Charles may not have realized in that moment, and did, she saw the danger not just in what was said, but in what could happen next. If Harry truly intended to monetize their private exchanges, the monarchy was staring down a scandal unlike any before. And so, the scene closes with Charles slumping back in his chair, burden heavier than his crown. Harry walking out, face set, determined, convinced he'd made his point. And somewhere in the palace, and waiting, knowing that this wasn't just a family rift anymore, it was a crisis. But here's the cliffhanger. How did and take this private knowledge and escalate it into something the entire firm could no longer ignore? How did one sister, often overlooked, become the catalyst for Harry's potential banishment? That's where the next chapter leads us, into the heart of the firm itself, as the monarchy circles the wagons and prepares to act. What happens when the royal family senses that one of their own has become a liability too great to ignore? That's the question that crackled through the walls of Buckingham Palace in the days following Harry's secret Clarence House meeting. Because once whispers reached Princess and the machinery of the firm began to whir into motion. And when the firm circles the wagons, it doesn't do so lightly. It does so with centuries of survival instinct, sharpened by every scandal and betrayal that has come before. The firm. It sounds almost clinical, doesn't it? But that's precisely how the monarchy functions behind the glittering facade. The firm isn't about sentiment. It isn't about hugs, apologies, or family dinners. It's about preservation, control, image. And when and raised the alarm, when she presented what she knew or strongly suspected, the firm responded the only way it knows how, with cold, calculated strategy. Let's set the stage. After the Clarence House meeting, Charles reportedly looked weary, almost haunted. He confided to, and whether directly or through the subtle remarks that only siblings understand, that Harry's words had unsettled him, and didn't need to hear every detail. She had enough to draw her conclusion. Harry wasn't just venting. He was positioning himself. And that positioning could destroy the monarchy, if not dealt with. From there, and wasted no time, she convened trusted advisors, the old guard courtiers who understand palace survival like generals understand war. These were men and women who have weathered Diana's tell-all interviews, Andrew's disgrace, Meghan's allegations, and Charles's own scandals. They know the stakes. They know the playbook. The question before them was stark. How do you neutralize a threat when the threat comes from blood? First, containment. The firm would ensure that details of the Clarence House meeting did not leak beyond controlled whispers. Damage control begins with silence. But Anne was adamant. This couldn't remain just a secret. There had to be consequences. Because silence may protect for a day, but Harry's track record had shown that secrets eventually come out, often through Netflix contracts, memoirs, or podcasts. Second, strategy. If Harry truly intended to monetize private conversations, the firm had to prepare for impact. Lawyers were briefed. Advisors reviewed potential contracts Harry could be pursuing. Public relations experts drafted scenarios. What would happen if Harry gave another explosive interview? If he published another book? If he released details about Charles's reign that the public wasn't meant to know? And third, history. The monarchy thrives on precedent. And reminded them of the Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, whose obsession with Wallis Simpson led to abdication and exile. That crisis nearly destroyed the monarchy in 1936, but it also provided a blueprint. When a royal becomes too dangerous, you cut them off. You exile them. You strip their influence, if not their titles. And you make it clear. The crown comes first, always. Now, let me ask you, if you were sitting in that meeting, would you argue for mercy? For reconciliation? Or would you, and push for decisive action before the damage could metastasize? Anne's voice carried weight. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't vindictive. She was practical. She spelled it out. If Harry has even hinted at selling royal secrets, we cannot afford to wait for proof. By then it will be too late. Those words, or something close to them, set the tone. The firm understood. Waiting was no longer an option. But here's where the drama intensifies. Charles, torn between fatherly love and kingly duty, hesitated. Could he really exile his own son? Could he stomach the idea of making Harry an outsider forever? And, however, gave him little choice. She reminded him of the oath he swore to uphold the crown, of the late Queen's example, duty above all. And with William already fuming in the background, Charles was boxed in. The firm began preparing contingency plans. Behind closed doors, lawyers discussed the mechanics of title removal. Could Harry be stripped of Duke of Sussex? Could he be barred from using HRH? Publicists drafted statements about protecting the integrity of the monarchy. Advisors whispered of leaks to test public opinion. floating trial balloons to see if the public would support harsher action against Harry. And then came the irony. As the firm prepared to act, Harry himself seemed oblivious. He likely believed he had rattled Charles, that his words had left an impression. What he didn't realize was that those very words had triggered the palace's survival reflex. Instead of reconciliation, he had provoked retaliation. The firm had seen enough betrayals to know how to respond. From the abdication crisis to Diana's panorama interview, from Andrew's disastrous Newsnight appearance to Meghan's claims of racism. Every time, the monarchy survived not by sentiment, but by strategy. Harry had underestimated this. He thought he was playing chess with his father. He didn't realize he was playing against an institution centuries old, with a rulebook written in iron. And here's where the story twists again. While lawyers and advisors moved quietly, and herself prepared something far more direct. Not just whispers, not just strategy. She was ready to confront Charles with her findings, forcing him to choose once and for all, son or crown. But before that moment could come, the firm made its first subtle move. Certain newspapers, friendly to the palace, began publishing vague stories. Hints of concerns about Harry's conduct during his UK visit. Nothing direct, nothing explosive, just enough to prepare the public for what might come next. And so, the wagon circled tighter. The monarchy, bruised but unbroken, readied itself for the fight. But here's the cliffhanger. How did and deliver the ultimatum to Charles? And what exactly did she reveal that made even the king, torn by paternal love, finally concede that his son had to be cut off? That moment, Anne's ultimatum, is where the next chapter unfolds. What happens when a sister forces a king to choose between his crown and his own son? That is the knife-edge moment, princess, and created when she decided that silence was no longer an option. She had watched, waited, and pieced together the fragments of Harry's Clarence House visit. Now, she was ready to lay it all before Charles. Not as a sister, not as an aunt, but as the monarchy's fiercest defender. Picture the scene. Late evening at Clarence House. Charles is tired, still carrying the weight of his son's visit days earlier. His desk is cluttered with papers, red boxes filled with state documents, the endless grind of kingship. He looks older than his years, drained by the constant pull between duty and emotion. And then Anne arrives, and doesn't waste time on pleasantries. She has never been one for small talk, least of all when the crown itself is at risk. She stands firm, her voice steady, and she says what Charles has tried desperately to avoid. He's not here to reconcile, Charles. He's here to use you. Charles stiffens. The words land like a dagger. He wants to argue, to defend his son. But Anne pushes forward, relentless. She reminds him of Harry's record, how every time the family has extended a hand, Harry has taken it and later twisted it into material for profit. The Oprah interview, the Netflix series, Spare. Every conversation, every grievance, recycled and sold. And now, and insists, he's brought it to your study. He's treating your trust like currency. Charles shakes his head, torn. He mutters about Harry being lost, about him needing guidance, about his role as a father. But Anne cuts through it all. Her words are sharp. You are not just his father. You are the king. And a king cannot afford to be blackmailed by his own blood. Let's pause here. Imagine being Charles in that moment. You love your son. You grieve the distance. You want to believe reconciliation is possible. But your sister, the one you've always known to be blunt and brutally honest, is standing in front of you, telling you that your son is a threat to your reign. What would you do? Would you cling to hope? Or would you face the harsh truth? And doesn't stop there. She presents what she's learned. Staff whispers, fragments of conversation, hints that Harry spoke of opportunities and people willing to listen, and frames it for what it is, a veiled plan to turn private royal matters into public gold. She looks Charles in the eye and delivers the ultimatum. If you don't act now, he will destroy everything you've inherited. The room is silent. Charles feels the weight of his mother's legacy pressing on him. He remembers the Queen's mantra. I have to be seen to be believed. Public trust was her currency. And now Harry, her grandson, threatens to trade that very trust for money. What would she have done? Charles knows the answer. Elizabeth would have acted swiftly, coldly, without hesitation. Duty above all. But Charles is not his mother. His heart aches. His voice cracks as he tells, and he can't lose another son. Not after Diana. not after decades of fractured family ties. But Anne, her jaw set, responds with a chilling reminder. You've already lost him. The question is whether you'll lose the monarchy with him. This is the ultimatum, and it leaves Charles no place to hide. He can no longer straddle the line between father and king. He must choose. Meanwhile, Anne prepares the ground for what comes next. She informs senior courtiers, pressing them to draft the options: public distancing statements, title removals, restrictions on Harry's access to palace resources. The machinery of the firm begins to hum louder, fueled by Anne's insistence that action must be taken. But here's where the tension deepens. Word begins to leak. William hears of Anne's intervention. And William, already simmering with anger, doesn't just support her. He demands it. To him, Harry's betrayal is personal. To Anne, it's institutional. To Charles, it's both. And for the first time, Charles realizes he stands alone in defending his son. And so, the stage is set for confrontation. Anne has laid her cards on the table. Charles must either act, or risk losing not only his reign, but the loyalty of the very family who still stands by him. But here's the cliffhanger. What happens when blood loyalty collides head-on with royal duty? When a father's love for his son clashes with the cold calculations of a sister who will stop at nothing to protect the crown? The answer comes in the next chapter, where betrayal is weighed not in whispers, but in blood, and Harry's place in the family is judged more harshly than ever before. What happens when loyalty is tested not by strangers, but by blood? That's the devastating weight pressing down on the royal family, as Anne's ultimatum reverberated through Clarence House. Because make no mistake, Anne's words weren't just suspicion. They were an accusation, a charge of betrayal, and not just betrayal of a father or of a brother, but of the monarchy itself. Let's sit with that for a moment. Harry wasn't just another wayward royal. He wasn't a cousin embarrassing the family at a party or an uncle stepping into scandal. He was the king's son, the late queen's grandson, a prince of the realm. His very bloodline tied him to the throne. And yet, in Anne's eyes, he had crossed the one line no royal could ever come back from. He had betrayed the crown. The irony is cruel. Harry once swore an oath as a soldier to serve queen and country. He risked his life in Afghanistan, wore the uniform with pride, and was hailed as a hero. He represented loyalty, sacrifice, and service. And yet, years later, that same man now stood accused of selling out the institution he once fought to uphold. How does someone go from valor on the battlefield to whispers of treason in a palace corridor? The answer, and believed, was choice. Every step Harry took, Oprah, Spare, Netflix, wasn't just grief or rebellion. It was a decision. A choice to trade loyalty for leverage, to weaponize pain, to turn memory into merchandise. And in Clarence House, when he spoke of opportunities and hinted at people willing to listen, and saw not a grieving son, but a calculating operator. And here's where the betrayal cuts deepest. Because Harry wasn't just exposing the firm's cold machinery. He was exposing his father, his brother, his aunt, his grandmother's legacy. He was taking the most intimate details of the monarchy and dangling them before the highest bidder. And that wasn't just betrayal, it was exploitation. Now imagine being William in this moment. He hears Anne's account. He listens to whispers from aides. And the fury boils inside him. This isn't just about the crown for William, it's about family. About a brother he once trusted, laughed with, fought alongside. A brother who now seemed determined to turn their shared childhood into a weapon. Picture the conversation. William pacing, fists clenched, telling Anne that Harry has gone too far. That he's crossed a line no brother can forgive. And, calm and composed, agrees, but frames it differently. To her, it's not about forgiveness. It's about defense. He's not just your brother anymore, William, she might have said. He's a threat to the monarchy. And what about Charles? Torn in two, his heart breaking. A father who wants to see the little boy he once cradled, not the man now accused of blackmail. But every time he tries to defend Harry, and in William counter with facts. His history, his words, his actions. It's as though Charles is clinging to a ghost, while the rest of the family is staring at the reality. Let me ask you, what would you do if your own sibling or child betrayed you not once, but repeatedly, each time for personal gain? At what point does loyalty become self-destruction? The betrayal of blood is always the hardest to accept, And that's why this moment is so shattering. The monarchy isn't built on democracy. It isn't built on contracts. It's built on loyalty, familial, generational, unwavering. If that loyalty crumbles, the entire institution is at risk. And now, thanks to Harry's choices, the family was staring at a crisis that cut to its very DNA. And wasn't shaken. She knew what had to be done. She had seen enough to understand that family ties couldn't shield Harry any longer. His betrayal wasn't just personal, it was existential. The monarchy's survival demanded sacrifice. And if that sacrifice was her own nephew, so be it. The firm began to solidify its plans. Advisors whispered about contingency measures. Lawyers drafted papers in case titles needed to be stripped. Publicists quietly tested narratives with trusted journalists, laying the groundwork for a story of duty over indulgence. Every piece was moving into place, like soldiers before a battle. And here's the cruelest part of all. Harry may have walked away from Clarence's house believing he still had power, that his words had rattled Charles, that his leverage remained intact. He couldn't see what and already had. The firm was no longer debating. It was preparing to act. And so, betrayal gave way to fury. Fury in William, betrayed by a brother. Fury in and betrayed by a nephew. And beneath it all, sorrow in Charles, betrayed by his son. But here's the cliffhanger. When William's fury boiled over and he demanded action, how did the firm respond? Did they hesitate, torn by the weight of blood ties? Or did they finally agree that Harry's betrayal could only be answered with banishment? That's where the next chapter takes us. Into William's rage, and the breaking point that left the family no choice but to turn their fury into action. What happens when a brother's love finally breaks under the weight of betrayal? That is the storm Prince William unleashed when word of Harry's Clarence House meeting reached him, not in vague whispers, but in stark, undeniable detail. For years, William had tried to balance his fury with restraint. He'd tolerated Oprah. He'd endured spare. He'd swallowed the Netflix series that painted him as cold and unfeeling. But this was different. This wasn't just Harry airing grievances. This was Harry allegedly plotting to use their father, the king himself, as leverage. And that, to William, was unforgivable. Picture the moment. William in Windsor, scrolling through reports from aides, listening to Anne's firm words replay in his head. He paces the room, jaw tight, fists clenched. The fury isn't just about what Harry said, it's about what it meant. To William, it was the clearest proof yet that his brother had crossed the point of no return. Now, you have to understand something about William. He is not his father. He doesn't stew quietly. He doesn't dither between emotion and duty. William is decisive, fiery, and deeply protective of the monarchy he will one day inherit. Where Charles hesitates, William acts. And in this moment, he made his decision. Harry was finished. Let me ask you, if your own sibling tried to undermine your family, would you still defend them? Or would you, like William, see them as an enemy? William's fury was personal, but it was also political. He thought of the monarchy not as abstract tradition, but as his children's future. George, Charlotte, Louis. He had sworn to protect their inheritance. And if Harry threatened that inheritance, then Harry had to be removed. Imagine William confronting Charles. The king sits heavy in his chair, torn, exhausted. William, standing tall, voice sharp with rage, doesn't mince words. He's blackmailing you, Pa, don't you see it? He's using you. And if you let him, he'll drag all of us down with him. Charles tries to defend Harry, speaking of reconciliation, of second chances. But William's eyes blaze. There are no second chances left. He's shown us who he is, time and again. If you let him stay in this family, you betray the rest of us. This wasn't just anger. This was a demand. William, the future king, was drawing his line in the sand. Either Charles acted against Harry, or William himself would take matters into his own hands. And, standing by, lent her quiet but unyielding support. Where William's fury was fire, Anne's resolve was stone. Together, they presented Charles with a united front. For the first time, Charles realized the balance had shifted. It wasn't just impressing him anymore. It was his heir, his successor, the future of the monarchy itself, staring him down with cold, furious eyes. And let's not forget the irony here. Harry and William, once inseparable, had been the image of unity. Two boys walking behind their mother's coffin. two brothers bound by grief and love. And now, those same brothers stood on opposite sides of a battlefield. William, the defender of the crown. Harry, the accused betrayer. The bond that had once defined them was now the very weapon tearing them apart. Here's a twist. William wasn't just angry at Harry. He was angry at Charles, too. Angry that his father hesitated, that he still clung to paternal hope. To William, Charles's hesitation wasn't compassion, it was weakness. And William, preparing himself for kingship, would not allow weakness to jeopardize the monarchy. So the fury boiled over. In private, William raged. He told trusted aides that Harry was finished. He confided to Kate that the monarchy couldn't survive another scandal at Harry's hands. And in council with Anne, he pressed harder than ever. If we don't act now, we'll regret it for the rest of our lives. Now let me turn it to you. Was William right? Was his fury the righteous defense of the monarchy? Or was it the final nail in the coffin of brotherhood, sealing a rift that could never heal? The firm responded. Advisors drew closer. Discussions grew sharper. Title removal, financial cuts, restricted access. Every option was on the table now, no longer whispers, but concrete strategy. And behind it all was William's fury, fueling the machine like fire under iron. And yet, here's where the drama sharpens even more. Because while William demanded action, Harry himself had no idea the storm he had unleashed. He thought Clarence House was just another conversation. He thought Charles's hesitation meant opportunity. He didn't realize that in William's fury, the verdict had already been written. The betrayal was complete. The fury was uncontainable. And the family, once divided by caution, was now united by anger. But here's the cliffhanger. As the palace plotted its next steps, how did the firm move from private fury to public strategy? How did they prepare the world for the possibility that a prince, the king's own son, could be cut off forever? That's where the next chapter leads us, behind palace gates, where silence gave way to strategy, and the storm inside the family began to spill into the corridors of power. What happens when the walls of Buckingham Palace become less a sanctuary and more a war room? That's exactly what unfolded after William's fury and Anne's ultimatum forced the firm into action. The whispers of Clarence House were no longer private suspicions. They were now fuel for a full-scale strategy session, the kind of palace maneuvering that has kept the monarchy alive for centuries. Behind those gilded gates, silence was shattered by urgency. Advisors, courtiers, press secretaries, and legal teams gathered in hushed but frantic conversations. The question at hand wasn't whether Harry had gone too far, and William had already decided that he had. The question was how to respond. How to protect the monarchy from a son of the king who seemed determined to cash in on its secrets. The mood was electric, tense, and heavy. Imagine it. Long oak tables in private chambers, the air thick with the weight of history. The faces of those present were pale with the realization that they weren't dealing with a wayward cousin or a minor scandal. They were facing the king's son, a prince, and yet, one who now posed the gravest danger to the crown's survival. First came the PR advisors. They knew that perception was everything. If the palace moved too quickly, they would look cruel, vindictive, feeding Harry's narrative that he was a victim of a cold and uncaring family. But if they moved too slowly, Harry could strike first. Another interview, another memoir, another Netflix-style deal that painted the firm as villains while making him millions. Timing, they said, was everything. Then came the legal teams. Could Harry be stripped of his dukedom? Could he be barred from using his royal highness? These weren't just questions of optics. They were questions of law. Legal precedents were dug up, from the Duke of Windsor's exile to the removal of Andrew's public roles. Lawyers debated fiercely. Was it wiser to cut Harry loose formally, or to leave him dangling, powerless but still technically tied to the crown? Meanwhile, the courtiers, those unseen power brokers who have served monarchs for generations, whispered their warnings. They knew that public opinion could turn quickly. The monarchy's strength lies not in force, but in faith. If the people believed Harry was treated unfairly, it could backfire. But if the people believed Harry was exploiting the crown, then decisive action would be applauded. How could they frame the story to tilt sympathy away from Harry and toward the firm? And here's where Anne's voice cut through again. Cold, clear, relentless. She told them all, "We cannot wait for him to strike first. We must take control of the narrative." Her words, simple yet unyielding, shifted the conversation. The firm began moving from defense to offense. But here's where irony crept in. While the palace strategized, Harry carried on unaware. He may have been in Montecito, sipping coffee in the Californian sun, believing Clarence House had left his father rattled. Perhaps he thought he still held the upper hand. What he didn't realize was that, even as he smiled for cameras or planned his next venture, an invisible war machine was whirring into life back in London, one aimed directly at him. This brings us to another layer of tension: the press. Friendly journalists, those who had long maintained close ties with palace insiders, began receiving quiet nudges. Stories were floated, not explosive ones, but subtle seeds. Headlines about concerns over Harry's recent behavior. Articles questioning whether Harry had truly burned his bridges with the family. Trial balloons, testing the waters of public opinion. And the response? Mixed, but telling. Some readers sympathized with Harry, insisting he was misunderstood. But many others, loyal monarchists, weary of his constant revelations, nodded in agreement. Enough is enough, they muttered. And that was all the palace needed to hear. Inside those rooms, the strategies hardened. One plan proposed was to freeze Harry out entirely. No access, no invitations, no privileges. Another was more radical. Begin the process of stripping his dukedom. Yet another suggested a quieter route: starve him of material. Refuse to meet privately. Refuse to share anything that could later be turned into cash. In short, make him irrelevant. Now, let me ask you, if you were sitting in that room, what would you advise? Cut him off completely and risk looking cruel? Or quietly suffocate his influence until he has nothing left to trade? Charles, as always, wavered. His heart still pulled toward Harry, even as logic screamed otherwise. But William, voice rising, slammed his fist on the table, figuratively, if not literally. He's done. Act now, or regret it forever. And, silent beside him, gave the slightest nod. The storm outside the palace gates was building. The press sensed something was brewing. Courtiers tightened their grip on information. Every corridor buzzed with speculation. And behind closed doors, the monarchy prepared for one of the most decisive moves in modern royal history. But here's the cliffhanger. As plans crystallized, as the firm debated exile and punishment, whispers began that Anne herself was preparing to deliver the decisive blow, not through words, but through action. What exactly did she do that tipped the balance from strategy into execution? That is where the next chapter takes us, into the whispers of banishment, and the shocking move that left Harry cornered like never before. What happens when whispers of exile stop being hypothetical and begin to sound like inevitability? That's exactly where the royal family found itself in the aftermath of Clarence House. The firm was no longer just strategizing, it was sharpening its blades. And at the center of it all, one chilling phrase began to echo in the palace halls: banishment. The word alone carries centuries of history. Royals exiled for disobedience. Dukes stripped of power. Princes cast out for treason or scandal. Each time, the monarchy survived because the institution always came before the individual. And now, Harry, son of the king, once the beloved spare, was being spoken of in the same breath as those banished before him. Let's set the scene. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, courtiers debated in hushed, urgent tones. Some argued for mercy. Others insisted mercy had already been tried, again and again, and each time, Harry repaid it with betrayal. And, ever pragmatic, cut through the noise. This isn't just about family anymore. It's about the crown. If he's allowed to continue unchecked, he'll pull us all down with him. And William? His fury, still burning from days earlier, had hardened into cold determination. He wasn't just angry, he was resolute. For William, banishment wasn't an option. It was the only option. If he wants to live as an outsider, William reportedly said, then let's make him one. Now let's pause. What does banishment mean in today's world? It's not as if Harry would be shipped to some distant island or locked in a tower. No, modern banishment is subtler, but just as brutal. It means no titles, no invitations, no privileges. A prince reduced to nothing more than a celebrity clinging to the remnants of his past. A man forever tied to royalty by blood, yet cut off from it entirely by decree. And this, perhaps, is the greatest irony. Harry, who had sought independence from the monarchy, may now find himself forcibly independent, stripped of every royal tether he once tried to control. The discussions turned darker still. Lawyers pored over the constitutional mechanics. Could Harry be stripped of Duke of Sussex? Could HRH be rescinded formally, not just symbolically? Advisors raised the precedent of Andrew, whose titles and patronages were ripped away after scandal. If we could do it to him, one argued, why not to Harry? Charles, as always, wavered. His heart fought against his duty. He thought of Diana, of the pain his sons endured after her death. He thought of the image of two little boys walking behind her coffin. Could he truly turn his back on one of them? But and reminded him of another coffin, the Queen's. Elizabeth II had carried the monarchy through storms with an iron will.